The woman in the yard. The delivery truck rolled to a stop at the curb, brakes snapping the quiet like a small clap. Julian pulled on his gloves and climbed down, the sun already low and syrupy over the rows of neat houses. He'd made this run 100 times, magazines and boxes, smiling at the people who answered their doors, but today something felt wrong. The house at the end of the street had always looked tidy, a low white picket fence, a small swing under a maple tree, the scent of roses in summer. Now the grass was tall and wild, the roses choked under vines, and the porch was a litter of newspapers. The letterbox sagged with age. He stepped off the sidewalk and walked across the yard toward the back, intending to leave the package by the shed like he always did for old Mrs. Collins. The path was soft with moss. A breeze pushed through the yard and the maple leaves whispered. Julian's shoes sank slightly into damp soil near the garden shed. Then something caught his eye, a pale shape, half hidden under a tangle of fallen branches. For a moment Julian thought it was a pile of trash, a discarded lawn chair, or an old doll left by a child playing. But the shape did not look like trash. It was a sleeve, thin and wrinkled, and where the sleeve ended, a hand lay palm up in the dirt. The hand was still. The hair on Julian's arms prickled. The world seemed to stop. The birds, the distant sound of traffic, even the maple leaves, all of it became small and thin, like paper. He shouted, because it was the only thing his voice could do. His shout broke the hush and sent a neighbor's dog barking. Julian's heart thudded loud and fast. He felt suddenly very small. He moved closer. The hand had dirt under its nails. A scarf was tangled around the neck. Beneath the branches, he could see the face of an older woman. Her eyes were closed. Her mouth was slightly open, as if she had been about to say something but the words never came. He knelt down, the gravel biting his knees, and felt for a pulse at the wrist. There was none. He called 911 with shaking fingers. The dispatcher's voice sounded far away, like someone speaking through water. Julian crouched beside her and waited, clutching the package to his chest as if it were armor. Sirens came, thin and bright. 2 patrol cars pulled up, then an ambulance. Neighbors, drawn by the noise, peered from behind curtains and front doors. A policeman put a gloved hand on Julian's shoulder and said, "You found her like this?" Julian could only nod. The policeman covered the woman with a clean sheet out of habit and respect. The sheet flapped a little in the breeze, a white flag on the green lawn. They called her Mary Collins. She was 75 years old and had lived in that house for more than 40 years, the police said. She gardened in the spring and fed the neighborhood cats. She wrote letters by hand and kept her curtains drawn at night. Her family lived far away. She had no close neighbors who checked on her every day. The coroner and detectives came and walked the property with flashlights, their shoes making soft crunches in the grass. Julian watched them move like shadows. He felt guilt bloom inside him, a hot, ugly thing. He had seen the papers. He had seen the overgrown yard. He had thought she would be fine. The official story came quickly. A storm 3 nights before had knocked down an old branch. Mary had gone out to the backyard and slipped. She had broken her hip and could not move. She had stayed where she lay through the rain and the dark, and no one had found her until now. The detective said it was a tragedy of loneliness, simple and terrible. But then something else broke the neat edge of that explanation. Someone, a neighbor whose name was Rosa, said she had seen lights in Mary's window on the night after the storm. She had been walking her dog and had stopped near the corner. Through the thin curtains she had seen a soft, blue light move across the living room wall like a hand. She had thought it was a TV. She had thought Mary could be watching a late show. It was only after the body was found that Rosa told the police. She insisted the light had not looked like TV light. It was the wrong color, and it slid along the wall the way a finger would slide across paper. At first the detectives wrote it down under witness statements. They treated it with polite distance. People told stories when something shocking happened. But that night, when the street went quiet again, a different kind of quiet settled over the block, the kind that brushes across the skin like cold breath. Julian slept badly. He dreamed he was in the yard, beneath the maple tree, and that branches moved like hands above him. He woke with his mouth dry and the taste of copper in his mouth. He told himself to stop thinking about it. It was an accident. People fell and could not call for help. The telling began where anything begins, small things, easy to miss. Mary lived alone, but she was not lonely in the way the police meant. She had neighbors who waved and said hello. She baked pies sometimes and left slices on her front steps for anyone who wanted one. Her handwriting was neat, with little loops on the letters. She liked the color blue and collected small glass birds that caught the morning light. Neighbors remembered odd little things, fragments that did not hurt until you put them together. A cat that would not go near Mary's house one night. A stranger walking past the yard at dusk and lingering too long. A single child's shoe on the porch that was not a child's shoe for any child on the block. Once, a mailman said the mailbox had been open even though it had not been that morning. The small things stacked up like dust. Mary's life, seen from the outside, looked quiet and ordinary. She kept her curtains drawn because she liked privacy. She planted a vegetable patch behind the shed and once gave the neighbor boy a tomato that he said tasted like sun. Her niece came twice a year to check on her, and then left. The neighborhood watch group had meant well but lacked follow-through. There were promises to check on people, soon, and phone numbers exchanged over the fence that were never called. And then there was the storm. The weather service called it a squall, sudden and sharp. The wind bent the maples and the rain came down in sheets. Down branches piled along the curb. The next morning, the sun came out like nothing had happened, and people went to work and school and to the grocery store, carrying umbrellas that dried on the porch rail. Mary did not come out to sweep her walk. Newspapers collected on her porch. A neighbor thought she saw a light through the curtains but assumed Mary was fine. After Julian found her, the detectives pieced together the last days of Mary's life from hard, small evidence. The calendar on the kitchen wall with a grocery list in the corner, a kettle on the stove with rings of old water stains, a sweater left on the arm of her chair. In the shed, a broken garden rake lay half under a tarp. They found no sign of forced entry, no fighting, no jewels gone. The footprints in the mud were hers and hers alone. But in the corner of the yard by the old hydrangea bush, there was a patch of ground where the grass seemed to have been pressed down in the shape of a low chair. The police took pictures and measured. The coroner recorded time of death as within the 3 days since the storm. That was that, until little things began to happen that did not fit the neat explanation. A week later, when friends had started to pack Mary's things, a volunteer opened a box of her letters and found one that she did not remember writing. It was addressed to no one, a short note scrawled in a shaky hand. I am not alone in the yard. At first, the volunteer thought it was a joke or a fragment of a dream. But the paper smelled faintly of something like rain and old leaves, even though it had been stored in a dry closet for years. The handwriting was Mary's, but the words were not the kind of thing she usually wrote. Then, at dusk, when the volunteers were moving a heavy trunk across the floor, the lights in the room flickered and a cold draft came from nowhere. A photograph fell from the trunk and landed face down. When one of the volunteers picked it up, she saw a picture of Mary in front of her house, smiling. But behind Mary in the yard there was a shadow, not a person exactly, but a darker shape, like a stain on the air. The volunteers laughed to break the chill, but the air in the room felt thin. People on the block exchanged nervous looks. Some said Mary had been lonely, and that was all. Some said the storm had been cruel. Others clung to the more secretive idea that something else had been there with her in the yard. The children in the neighborhood whispered and dared each other to peek over the fence at night. The dares were shrugged off by the adults, who wanted to preserve a sense of safety. But the idea lingered like a half-heard song. On the first night the house sat empty, a neighbor, old Mr. Hayes from 2 doors down, woke to the sound of someone walking in his backyard. He leaned out of his window and saw a soft blue light pass between the houses, skimming the tops of the hedges like a fish breaking the surface of a pond. He thought it might be a police car, but there were no sounds and no headlights on the road. The light moved in a slow, searching way, like someone looking for something in the dark. The hairs on his neck stood up. He called his daughter and told her he had seen something strange, but she told him to rest and that the mind plays tricks when it is tired. Then the real oddness began. The newspapers on Mary's porch, stacked and damp, were rearranged the next day into a neat pile, as if someone had put them there. The neighbors agreed that they had not touched them. A small blue bird, the kind Mary kept in a glass bowl, was found on the front step, alive and blinking though it had not been seen for days. The bird looked at anyone who passed with a steady, strange intelligence, then flew away at dawn. Julian found himself walking past the house more often. He told himself he was only curious, that his conscience pulled him, but there was also a feeling he could not describe. Sometimes he stopped at the edge of the yard and listened. He thought he heard faint breathing, or maybe someone humming. Once he saw the sheet that covered Mary's body, left in the back of the driveway until the coroner took it, move as if a breeze had caught it, though there was no wind. He told himself his eyes were tired. He told himself stories to keep the dark away. One night, as rain began to tap the roof and the streetlights blinked like tired eyes, Julian walked across the yard carrying a small lantern. He wanted to look at the spot where Mary had lain, to see if anything had been missed. The lantern made a yellow pool on the grass. His footsteps were soft. He reached the shed and stopped. The damp smell rose from the earth. He knelt down and brushed away a fallen leaf. The ground felt empty yet somehow full. It was like the moment before a word is said and the air waits for it. Julian felt as if someone watched him from behind the curtains of the dark house. He whispered, "Mrs. Collins?" The name felt foolish in his mouth. For an instant the world held its breath. Then, from somewhere beneath the maple roots or behind the shed, something moved. It was not a branch or a rat. It was a slow, deliberate shift, like a body settling. Julian's lantern trembled in his hand. He leaned forward, eyes wide. He should have turned and run, called the police, begged for help, anything but move closer. Instead, he crawled a tiny bit forward, drawn like a moth to a small flame. A voice came from the dark, but it was neither wholly human nor wholly not. It was thin and old and sounded like paper torn softly. "Don't leave me," it said. Julian froze. The sound scraped along his skin and left a cold mark. The lantern guttered, then steadied. Behind him, the row of houses breathed in, as if the whole street waited to see what would happen next. He reached out a hand, but before it touched anything, the sound came again, not from the ground but from the house itself, low behind the curtains where Mary once sat. The shutters rattled like teeth. A window, second floor, half open, gave a slow, wet exhale. The voice whispered a name, not Mary's, not any neighbor's, but Julian's. It said his name like someone who knows a secret. Julian stumbled back, the lantern clattering from his hand. The light went out and the yard flooded with the blue of the night. From the dark behind the shed, something rose, not a shadow exactly, but a darker darkness, as if the night folded and pulled itself up into shape. It moved toward the sheet that had once covered Mary's body and settled over it like a second skin. Julian ran. His breath punched in his chest. He reached the sidewalk and did not stop until he was inside his own house, doors locked, phone trembling in his hand. He called Rosa first, then Mr. Hayes, then anyone who would pick up. Voices answered through the wire in sleepy confusion. They said, "You should not go back there." They said, "We are coming." When they gathered at the house, flashlights and worry in their hands, the yard looked ordinary under the rain glass. The sheet lay in the driveway where it had been placed. The newspapers were gone. The bird was nowhere. The hydrangea bush was intact. No footprints led away. The detectives took statements and measured the air for anything out of the ordinary. They found only damp earth and the smell of wet leaves. But near the shed, pressed into the soil, were shallow marks, not like footprints, not exactly like anything human. They were the shape of hands, and they led in a path that stopped at the edge of the fence, then vanished into the dark as if the ground itself swallowed them. The neighbors stood in the rain, breathing hard, staring down at the marks. They felt foolish, but a new fear had settled in them, not the clean fear of an accident, but the slow, patient fear that something else might not be done, that whatever had been in the yard the night Mary died had not finished its search. Julian wanted to be brave. He wanted to believe in simple explanations. But his hands still shook. He could not unhear that voice, not fully human, not fully not. He kept saying to himself, "It was the wind! It was the wind!" But the words were thin, like paper, and the wind did not answer. A child in the group, little Emma from 2 doors down, 10 years old and brave in a way adults sometimes forget, bent down and put her fingers in the hand-shaped marks. She stared at them a long time, and then she looked up at the adults with eyes far older than her small face. "She's not alone," Emma whispered. "She's never been alone." The wind took her words and carried them across the yard, through the maple, and into the dark where branches lay like sleeping bones. The police made notes, took photos, and tried to keep order. But as the neighbors left that night, one by one, each went home feeling the same tightness in the chest, a knot of worry and unease that something in the yard had not been found and would not be, not yet. They locked their doors and pulled curtains and slept with lights on. The street, so proud of its neatness and calm, felt suddenly like it had a secret under its skin. And somewhere in the dark house that had belonged to Mary Collins, a curtain twitched, ever so slightly, though no one could say why. The chapter closes here, as the rain clings to the windows and the town holds its breath. Outside, the yard waits. Inside, something listens. And beneath the maple, the shape of those hand marks remains in the soil like a promise that what happened that day was not only an accident, and that the woman in the yard was only the beginning. The rain stopped. The street shook itself dry under a new sun. People went back to work and school. They took the same bus, folded the same napkins, and tried to fold the strange night into something they could leave behind. But the yard at the end of the block kept breathing in a way that did not match the neighborhood clocks. It breathed slow and patient. It kept its secret. They held a small funeral for Mary on a Tuesday. The church smelled of lilies and old wood. Julian sat near the back with his head down. Rosa and Mr. Hayes were there. Little Emma held a single blue paper bird between her fingers, a tiny thing she had made because Mary loved blue. The priest said gentle things about crossing over and being at peace. People cried, some quietly, some openly. They told stories that made everyone laugh and then tremble. Someone said Mary had once driven over a mailbox and written a note apologizing to the postman with a piece of pie left on the porch. Another person remembered how Mary hummed strange songs while she watered the tomatoes. After the funeral, some neighbors went to the house to bring flowers. The front door had a polite police tape across it. The coroner had packed Mary's things into boxes. Her niece had come for the papers and the little glass birds. The house felt too large for one person. People moved through it like guests in a room where a party had ended. They placed flowers on the porch steps and whispered that they would watch each other better. For a while, the odd things slowed. The lights that had slipped like fingers along the walls did not show themselves as often. The blue bird did not reappear. The hand-shaped marks in the soil blurred out with rain and foot traffic. The neighborhood breathed a little easier. The detectives left more often, their cameras and measuring tape packed away. They had stories to file and neat boxes of evidence. The newspapers wrote a few paragraphs and then a quiet notice in the obituaries. That calm lasted about a week. Then small things began to move again. A baby's blanket left on a porch would be found folded inside the house. A group of mailboxes were left open in the morning though no one had touched them. A stray cat that loved to sleep under the maple by Mary's house stopped coming by and would sit on the roofs of neighboring garages, watching the yard. The volunteers who had packed Mary's things said one of her letters kept changing. One day it read, "I am not alone in the yard." The next day, when they opened the box, the line looked different. "I am not alone in the house." The ink did not smear. The words simply shifted, as if they were breathing. Neighbors began to have the same dream. They woke in the dark with their hearts racing and an image pressed behind their eyes, hands pressed flat into damp earth. Even people who had only driven by the street felt a cold place in their chest when they passed the maple tree. They started checking on each other for real. The watch group began to meet every night for 10 minutes. They carried flashlights and a sense of responsibility that felt new and heavy. Julian found himself there most nights. He could not stop thinking about Mary. He wanted to make up for the days he had not looked in, the days he had seen newspapers piling up and thought, "I'll do it tomorrow." He lit a small lamp in his kitchen and left it on until dawn. He left a bowl of warm milk on his porch in case a stray cat wanted it. He said Mary's name to himself like a prayer. He told himself that if there was any wrong in the world, he could help fix one small piece. Emma watched everything with eyes like a mirror. She seemed to hold a kind of bravery that made adults uneasy. She came to the watch meetings with a flashlight shaped like a star and a thick coat. She told the adults she could not sleep. She said she heard a voice like paper that called through the curtains. The adults nodded and off they went to bed, because adults must sleep and do the next day's work. But Emma stayed. She sat on the curb by Mary's fence and hummed into the dark like someone trying to keep the night gentle. One night, when the moon was a thin coin in the sky, Emma walked through the gate and into the yard. Julian wanted to stop her, and almost did. He saw the way her small hand reached for the damp grass, and the way she did not flinch when the wind touched her face. She moved toward the place where the handmarks had been. She sat down and folded her knees like she had been taught in school. "Hello?" she said, as if she spoke to a neighbor. For a long minute nothing answered but the rustle of leaves. Then the air cooled and the scent of old rain filled Julian's nose. A small sound came from the shed, like a piece of paper dragged across wood. Emma's eyes flicked up. She smiled, not with teeth first, but with the light in her eyes. "Are you lonely?" she asked. This time, the voice did not come from the shed or the ground. It came from everywhere and nowhere. It sounded like a page turning in a book that had not been read in years. "Yes," it said. The word was softer than a mouse. Emma laughed a little, proud and not afraid. She reached into her pocket and took out the paper bird she had made. She put it on the ground and set her palm flat beside it. The air sharpened like a bell. "Do you want to come with us?" she asked. "We can be your friends. We can help." The voice paused. It sounded like someone considering a long, difficult thing. Then it answered, but not in words, in a slow movement that rolled through the grasses. The fence creaked. The maple leaves shivered without wind. Julian watched Emma as if she were a small brave ship. Her face was steady. "What are you?" she asked. The thing made the soil under them lift in a small line, like a finger tracing letters. Julian bent down and saw the marks forming again. They were not prints this time but a pattern. They resembled the outline of many hands, joined finger to finger like a chain. The marks moved toward the house as if writing a sentence on the earth. Emma did not run. She sat there and listened with a patience that made Julian ache. "It needs someone to know it," she said finally. "It is not bad. It is only looking." Julian felt his throat tighten. Then, somewhere in the neighborhood, a light went on in a house that had been dark for days. A front door unlocked and opened just enough to let a cool breath out. A pair of slippers sat on the porch, empty. Word spread, as words do. People came that night, a smaller crowd than the first. They brought chairs and blankets. They left teacups and photographs. They tried to be kind in a way they had not been before. Someone read a poem. Someone told a joke. A slow, strange comfort filled the yard like a thin shawl. For a while, the presence eased. The marks in the soil curled back like sleeping vines. The house seemed less like a closed pocket, and more like a room with a window cracked open. People slept better. Julian dreamed that Mary leaned over her fence, and waved with the little hand he had once seen in the dirt. He woke with tears he had not known were waiting. And then one morning, before dawn, Mr. Hayes did not come to his usual coffee on the corner. He had been the first to say, "You should check on each other." And he had always had his cane leaning against the doorway. Now his front door stood open and his cane lay on the floor. The slippers were gone. On the porch, the potted plant had been knocked over and soil made a dark path across the wood. Neighbors searched, called, and finally found his hat near the fence by Mary's yard. The hat was soaked and heavy with rain that had not fallen. There were matching shallow hand marks in the mud, leading from Hayes's porch to the maple, and then they stopped. This small terror spread through the block. People started leaving their doors unlocked so anyone could run in. They sat together and waited like a family at a hospital. The detectives came again. They asked careful questions. They measured. They took photos. They wrote in their neat lines on paper. They found no footprints leading away from the yard. They found no drag marks, no sign of a struggle, no evidence that anyone had taken Mr. Hayes beyond the fence. But late that night, Emma woke the watch group with a whisper. She had seen, she said, lights moving across other lawns, like pale hands reaching from house to house. She said she had seen something small and blue fly across the street and then fold into the gutter like a paper bird. People went out with flashlights. They looked at each other, scared and brave at once. The yard had become a quiet center of a web. The hand marks in the soil were no longer only by the maple. They appeared in the gutters, on porches, near mailbox posts, and along the edges of driveways. They always started at Mary's yard and trailed outward. Julian followed one set of marks he found on his own lawn. They began at the edge of his neighbor's yard and came right up to his front steps. He felt the hairs on his arms rise. He checked his windows and found small, wet fingerprints on the inside of the glass. The prints had no clear ridge patterns like human fingerprints. They looked like smudges pressed with soft, cool palms. He was not brave this time. He called Rosa, and together they stood on his porch, watching the street. The night narrowed into the beam of a flashlight, and their breath made small clouds. They listened to the world hold its breath with them. Then, from the darkness, there was a soft knock. Not a hard knock, but a gentle, deliberate knocking pattern. It seemed to come from the direction of Mary's house but was very close, as if it tapped the air just outside their own door. Rosa wiped her hands on her coat. "Who's there?" she called, with a voice that did not tremble though her hands did. No answer came. The knocking stopped and then, after a long second, started again, softer this time, as if curious now. Julian turned the knob slowly. The door did not open. The light in his porch lamp flickered. He felt something press against his skin like a cold, wet palm. Rosa's eyes went wide. She stepped back. The knocking continued, but now it was not only at Julian's door. It came from every house on the block, a soft, synchronized tapping like someone walking around, pressing on things with careful hands. From somewhere near the maple, the air whispered a name, Mary, and then it spoke another name, clear as a bell, Julian. Julian's heart thudded so hard he thought the neighbors would hear it like a drum. He wanted to run, to lock every door, to gather everyone and leave town. But he found he could not move. The knocking slowed. The air softened, as if listening. Then, before anyone could decide what to do, a sound came from the inside of Julian's own house, the sound of something rubbing against the door. It was not a knock this time. It was the sound of small, cold fingers dragging slowly down the wood. Julian looked at Rosa. Her face was pale. Emma, who had come out wrapped in a blanket, pressed her small hand to her mouth. The watch group held their breath together, the neighborhood gathered in a single hush. The wooden door bowed inward a little, like someone pushing from the other side. For a second, nothing else happened. Then the porch light went out, and the yard filled with a pale blue that was not moonlight. The blue moved like a wave, washing across the fence and the hedges, and it left the air smelling of old paper and rain. Julian felt a voice settle around him, near his ear and far away at once. It said softly, "We will not be alone." The door did not open yet, but the sound of rubbing slowed and the knocking changed into something that sounded almost like someone smiling on the other side. The neighbors held one another's hands. They did not know whether to scream or sing. The lamplight hummed and then blinked. In the dark, something pressed a palm to the window and left a print that steamed for a second, like breath on glass. Julian reached for the knob again. His fingers were cold. The story that had started at the maple was not finished. It had begun to move, to reach from yard to yard, to find names and places where it could stay. Outside, the night listened. Inside, the block held its breath. The knocking became patient, as if whatever waited on the other side knew it had time. And then, the blue light rippled like water across the houses. Windows reflected it, puddles caught it, and sent it trembling over the walls. For one long moment, the street looked like it was underwater, slow, heavy, and hushed. Julian stood by the door, frozen, his hand still on the knob. Rosa whispered his name, but he didn't move. The sound of the knocking had changed. It was slower now, almost gentle. It didn't feel angry or threatening anymore. It felt lonely. Emma was the first to speak. Her voice was soft but clear. "She's looking for a door," she said. "She doesn't know which one is hers anymore." Rosa knelt beside her, confused. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Emma's eyes shimmered in the blue light. "She was alone too long. The yard isn't just hers now. It's hers and whatever was with her when she fell. They're together, and lost." The wind rose, carrying the faint sound of a woman humming. It was a song none of them recognized, something slow and old, like a lullaby someone hums to themselves in the dark. The humming came from everywhere, from Mary's house, from the trees, from the ground. Julian felt something tighten in his chest. "She said my name?" he whispered. "Why me?" Emma looked at him with the quiet understanding that only a child could have. "Because you found her," she said. "You woke her up." The blue light grew stronger, spreading from the yard across the street like fog made of color. It slid through mail slots, under doors, across windows. People began to step outside, drawn to it without knowing why. Old Mr. Wexler from across the street, Mrs. Denton with her walker, teenagers still in pajamas. All of them came out and stood in their yards, faces washed in blue. No one screamed. No one ran. The fear that had once filled them softened into something else, sorrow, maybe, or understanding. They could all hear it now, the humming of a woman and the slow heartbeat of rain returning. Emma walked forward through the gate and into Mary's yard again. The grass glowed faintly beneath her feet. She turned to Julian and said, "Come with me." He hesitated, but his feet moved anyway. Together they walked to the spot near the shed, the same place where Julian had found Mary's body. The air shimmered there, bending light like heat. Julian could see shapes within it, outlines of hands, faces half-formed, and at the center, the faint image of Mary herself, standing among the branches. She looked young again, or maybe just lighter, the way people look when they've put down a burden. Her eyes were kind. She looked at Julian, then at the girl beside him. Emma spoke softly. "You can rest now," she said. "They can see you. You're not alone anymore." The shape of Mary tilted her head, as if listening to a sound only she could hear. Then, slowly, she raised her hand. Her lips moved, and even though the words were almost too soft to hear, everyone understood them. "Thank you." The blue light pulsed once, bright enough to make everyone blink, and then began to fade. The wind sighed through the maple tree. The humming stopped. The world was still again. When the neighbors opened their eyes, the yard looked different. The grass was flat and green, the flowers upright. The old shed door, once splintered, was standing open, sunlight slipping through it. Mary's house looked empty but peaceful, the kind of empty that waits quietly instead of haunting. Julian took a deep breath. He didn't realize he'd been holding it. Rosa leaned on his shoulder, tears on her cheeks. Emma was smiling, but in that small, secret way that children smile when they understand more than they say. That night, for the first time in weeks, the street slept. No lights moved. No knocks came. The air felt normal again. The next morning, the yard was filled with birds, dozens of them, small and blue, singing in the maple tree. They perched on the fence, the mailbox, the porch rail. The neighbors came out to watch. Emma stood at the gate and said, "She found her way home." Julian nodded. He knelt and touched the grass where the handprints used to be. There was nothing there now, only earth, damp and alive. Days passed, and the story of the woman in the yard became something people whispered about but didn't fear. Some said it had been a haunting. Others said it was just the power of memory and guilt, twisting the mind. But when the wind moved through the maple tree, you could still hear a faint hum if you listened closely, like a voice saying thank you again and again in the rustling leaves. Months later, the house was sold. A young couple moved in with a baby boy. They painted the porch and fixed the fence. They planted new flowers. On the first day of spring, the woman of the house found something shining beneath the soil while digging near the shed, a small glass bird, blue as the sky. She cleaned it, smiled, and placed it on the windowsill. That evening, as the sun went down, the glass bird caught the light and threw it across the yard, a bright shimmer that danced like water on the walls. The new neighbors watched from their porch and said how peaceful it felt there, how calm the yard seemed, as if someone was quietly keeping watch. And when the wind picked up, the maple leaves whispered softly, carrying a voice that sounded almost human. A woman's voice. It said only 3 words, gentle, grateful, and fading into the breeze. I am home.